Today, I'm going to give you 3 tips to master movement in Zero Build in Chapter 6. After watching this video, you will not only know how to be a demon with the Typhoon blade, but will be absolutely impossible to hit in close and long range combat. So for tip number 1, we're going to talk about the general movement tips that pros and streamers use to nearly be impossible to hit. Right peaks are the most fundamental part that is overlooked and in my opinion is the most important skill to master if you want to have good movement. Because there are very advanced ways to use right peaks that you may not know about. Let me show you what I mean in creative. So let's say we have a player right here and I'm standing on this right peak to try and take some shots. Start out with the shotgun. So you could see this red X on my screen, and even though my reticle may see this enemy, I cannot shoot them because of that red X. I'm simply going to be hitting the wall. This doesn't matter if I ADS or not, which means I have to peek a little bit more to be able to hit this target. And this is not a bad peek at all, but there is a better way to do it. So instead, what you could actually do is simply back up, and from where I'm standing on this blue mark, and I'm going to put the blue mark kind of at the center of my body just to show where I'm standing, because it may look like I'm exposed from this perspective, but if we stand over where the player actually is and look at that blue mark, you quite literally cannot see me. This player may be lucky to see the fingers or the gun that I'm holding out. It's definitely something that I don't think enough people are talking about. However, with an AR, the red X does appear with this perspective, but if you do ADS it, that red X does disappear. Right peeking like this is very, very crucial, so you're exposing the least amount of body possible. And if I center my body, it'll be right around here, and obviously you'll just see like the shoulder or the arm from this perspective. Now, right peaks are a fundamental that should be engraved into your system. Anytime I see footsteps, I'm always putting myself in a position where I'm basically on a right peak. So for example, we have the player right here. If I push this player, instead of doing this and trying to come around the left, I'm gonna make sure I'm always in a habit to be on a right peak no matter who I am shooting. There's a player behind me coming in right now, so you see I'm here. I want to hug this, make sure I'm constantly on the right peak. Boom, I'm gonna fight this next player, make sure I'm on the right peak here. I'm not gonna over peak like this because this exposes my entire body. So this fundamental habit is what pros are really, really good at, and it makes them nearly unhittable. But I know you probably clicked on this video to see some juicy movement. That's exactly what we're gonna cover in tip number 2. Talk about breaking your opponent's camera. This right here is what separates the good players from the average players. Breaking your opponent's camera is having the ability to confuse your opponent because you're not even visible to them. And let's talk about how you are able to do that. A simple version of this is sprinting and sliding, and kind of go left to right as you're doing so. This is just a habit that you all need to get into, is sliding around so that you're more accustomed to using it. Then my personal favorite is to bunny hop. So that would mean me running up my opponent, doing this action right here. So what you want to do is sprint, cancel the sprint, and then bunny hop. And to do this, all you need to do is hit your crouch button and instantly hit your jump button right after. This is very effective with shockwaves. So if I see an opponent and I want to do this, I would want to shockwave right at him. As I land, I start bunny hopping, and I can hold my gun out and do this right here. You could also try and use this with tires. So let's say I'm able to make this player weak right here. What I'm going to do is bounce off of these tires and instantly bunny hop and get closer to them and close the distance, as I'm also able to take some shots out of it. But these bunny hops mean nothing if your opponent is looking dead at you, because all they have to do here is track you. So you need to learn to understand how to break your opponent's camera. So for example, let's say I'm fighting this player right here. Take some shots at him, and the instant that he decides to run at me, instead of just sitting here waiting for him to come, in order to break his camera, is as soon as he runs at me and he's in the sprinting animation, I instantly go to the tire and jump over his head. His perspective, it's gonna look crazy because you're running straight at him. First thing he sees is you're running in front of him, then you're bouncing off the tires, and he's having to go like this to try and figure out where you are. This confuses players more often than you think. And I think sliding is very underrated as a movement mechanic, because another thing I can do is simply slide out on him and start shooting like this, potentially make my way into the next piece of cover. Another thing you need to know is moving your camera doesn't look crazy on anybody else's screen. All it looks like is you're just spinning in circles, but you're standing still. The amount of times I see players fight and do something like this and try to avoid being shot, this only works against the very novice players. So instead, focusing on centering your aim, slide and make yourself harder to hit. Crouch spamming, of course, is very important to master. Make sure you get in the habit of it, because you don't want to be a sitting duck. Another thing is jump shots. If I have an opponent that's over some cover, instead of overexposing like this, peek for a brief second and hit this player. You also want to change up the angles from where you hit your opponent. A lot of times, crazy movement does not come in a form of sliding or bunny hopping around the map, but more so repositioning moving and taking shots from different angles, because the other player is constantly having to move their camera around, and the more they move the camera, the more likely you are to break it. Let me show you a solo versus squads example where I was able to wipe out a team using the things that we just talked about. So here I'm taking the first enemy of this team. You can see that I'm already weak from fighting them earlier on. So here, even though I'm super cracked after he takes some shots, I immediately get on the roof, jump over his head using my blade, and make sure I'm getting into cover as I'm also taking shots. And because I broke his camera, I was able to down him. Now I rushed to get the medkit that he dropped, and I immediately rushed to a different spot because I know his team is going to want to push. As I'm popping this medkit, I'm sitting on this pole holding a right peek, trying to read what they're doing. He lets me pop off the entire medkit, and I put myself on high ground. I play very patient here, and I'm only peeking these players when they peek. I don't expose myself unless I have to. Here they make a move on me, and what most players would do is fight this, but I immediately create distance and get onto the next possible cover to create a right peek. And because they put themselves in the open, I'm able to fry one of them and completely eliminate them using a jump shot right there, which is exactly what we just talked about. And now this is the last player on the team. I start popping this medkit, and as this player is running at me, I know I'm so weak I cannot just sit here. So as soon as I try to take a shot, I immediately reposition with the blade one more time, get behind this rock, and as he rushes me, I use the blade to jump over his head, and now he has to completely turn his camera. And as I'm sliding, I am taking some AR shots, and I'm able to completely eliminate him. But jumping over his head right there broke his camera, and sliding made it harder for him to hit me. And of course, I utilized my blade very well in that fight, which leads us to the very last and long-awaited tip: everything you need to do to master the blade movement. Let's go ahead and jump into creative, and I'll show you everything that's important when it comes to the blade. Surely by now you know how to use it to dash, but just in case you don't, let me briefly explain it. You want to sprint and then jump again when you're in the air, and hold the button in which direction you'd like to dash in, which means you can dash to the side, dash to the left, and dash backwards. Now when you run out of stamina, you literally just can't use the blade as a mobility. This is why it's important to learn to conserve your stamina, which we'll cover in a second. Now I don't see many people using these directional ways to change the dash direction. I would just use my camera to look in the direction that I want to dash in. It's simply just a little bit easier to control, especially if you're a mouse and keyboard. You're not clicking too many buttons at once and it's not confusing you. Here's some tricks that you may have not known with the blade. If you sprint with the blade out, you will have much better mobility. Your stamina will take longer to run out. You can use the tires on the bunkers the same way, but it'll send you a farther distance. So let's do a regular sprint into the tires. Place a marker down. That sends us about 17 meters. But if I dash into these tires, it sends me a little bit past that. And the way I do it is simply stand right under the tires, simply stay right here, jump into it with a sprint, and here I go. And that doesn't count as a dash, so if you wanted to dash after you do it, you could keep going as well. You can hit it and then immediately dash again, going a little bit more distant. When fighting somebody with the blade, you want to think about this the same way that we talked about it in tip number 2. But think of the blade more as an enhancement to the mobility that you already have, as opposed to something that you can do with it that you can't do without it. For example, like we talked about bunny hopping. You could do a regular bunny hop like this, or you could do a more enhanced bunny hop if you use the dash and then go out of it and do this right here. And this conserves a lot of stamina. If I'm fighting this player, instead of hitting him and dashing around a bunch and trying to eliminate these players without taking a pause and instantly going into the dash, I'm already out of stamina, and if I have a third party when I'm done with these fights, I can be in big trouble because I can't get away. So instead what you do is you combine the blade dashes with the movement we talked about in tip number 2. So if I'm fighting this player, I would dash forward and then instantly continue bunny hopping. Look at how I'm not taking any stamina up, and then I can rinse and repeat, do the same thing. So instead of just going in and out of dashes, a lot of times just bunny hopping afterwards is effective enough to continue that momentum of the blade dash that you got going. Obviously, as you saw in the solo squads example, jumping over people's heads is even more effective. Now this next one is one I've been trying to master myself. I like to dash over their head, shoot my gun, and dash backwards before I'm even able to land. So something like this. And the way you do it is simple. So I'm fighting, and as I'm running forward, simply dash once and do the regular jump, because if you hold forward without pressing space, you still travel a little bit of distance forward. So I can use that forward momentum, pull out my gun, and then dash backwards or in any other direction that you'd like before hitting the ground. This takes a little bit more time and skill to master, makes it very effective of making it hard to predict your direction. If you're completely new to the game and these tips were a little bit overwhelming, consider watching the video that is on your screen.